The New Orleans Pelicans cut, then re-signed Matt Ryan. Wait, what? I'll tell you why they did this, but I'll also explain how it has big implications on two other players on the roster. It's a Tuesday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at Nola Jake on Twitter. Here with you on this Tuesday. We're going to go Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday this week here on Locked On Pelicans, as we are still 3 days a week, getting set for the regular season, but resting up a little bit. We got a lot more content coming for you this year, and I'm really excited about it. So today's show, we're going to talk about the Pelicans waiving and then re-signing Matt Ryan. There's a couple of things potentially going on here, but I think the bigger story, which we'll get to in the second segment, is the impact on Jordan Hawkins and Javonte Green. So more on them coming up later. And then you've got Dejounte Murray defending New Orleans from, shockingly, Josh Hart. We'll break it all down in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. And, of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We are the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans. Let me know if you're an everydayer down in the comments below. So let's get into it with Matt Ryan, because a couple of days ago it was reported by Shams Charania that Matt Ryan was being waived. And to be perfectly honest with y'all, that was no real surprise here. When you look before he was re-signed at the Pelicans salary cap situation, that makes an absolute ton of sense. You know, they had signed Javonte Green, and more on him in the next segment, that was maybe going to take some minutes from Matt Ryan. And with this team already over the luxury tax, you know, before adding Matt Ryan into this, it seems to kind of put the writing on the wall. Matt Ryan played very limited minutes for New Orleans, and while he's cheap shooting, and that's a useful thing, for your 15th man on the roster, do you need to go into the luxury tax? And even though I want the Pelicans to pay the luxury tax, I don't think you do it for a minimum signing kind of guy, someone who's likely not going to make a real impact on wins and losses for your team. So after they cut Matt Ryan, this team was into the luxury tax by about $1.55 million. We can round up and call it $1.6 million. Now they've re-signed him, and by doing so, and his cap hit being just over $2 million, they're back into the luxury tax of $3,645,000. So 3.6, let's round down and call it 3.6. So what's going on here? So first and foremost, by waiving him now and then re-signing him, they actually lowered his cap hit. He was set to make basically $2.2 million this year. Now by waiving him and then re-signing him, he's making about 2.1. It's a shade over $100,000 less than what he was making before. When it comes to the luxury tax, you know, that matters. That $100,000 is not $100,000. It's essentially $200,000. So by doing this, in one sense, it lowers the cap hit for the team as a whole and saves the team about $100,000, $200,000 by doing this sort of move. So it's a way to keep him on the team, but say, hey, we're going to basically pay you a little bit less, which isn't the greatest thing to do to somebody. But, again, for the right kind of player, I think this is a fine thing. What's also really interesting is what Shams says in his tweet announcing that the Pelicans are re-signing Matt Ryan, and that's to a restructured one-year deal. That word restructured looms rather big because we don't have all of the specifics here, but we're still trying to kind of figure it all out. But we can maybe understand what this means. He was on a non-guaranteed deal before he was waived, meaning they could waive him and not have to pay him a penny of that. that was going to be fully guaranteed by a certain date for the entirety of the season, and it was going to be for that amount. Maybe by restructuring his deal, they're bringing him back on a similar contract, but the guaranteed money is going to be less. And maybe this is a waive by January 15th. You only pay him part of the money, something along those lines. So it's a way to maybe make it a less, basically a veteran minimum with a partial guarantee. So you're not going to be on the hook for all of this should you want to waive him and open up roster flexibility. And that ties into, I think, one of the bigger parts about Matt Ryan here. While that wing shooting is cheap and good, roster flexibility for a guy that's your 15th man, something in that range, might be more important with it. Having an open roster spot means that if you make an uneven trade during the season, maybe it's Brandon Ingram, maybe it's somebody else, you have the option to not have to just waive someone and eat that sort of money. And for a team that is flirting with the luxury tax, let's say, maybe not wanting to pay it, maybe not wanting to pay that much, any dollar kind of matters when it comes to this sort of thing. So waiving a guy for $2 million, paying them $2 million, have it counting towards the luxury tax, but then not getting the benefit of that player is probably not something that New Orleans wants to do. And look, I will rightfully criticize them if they go cheap this year and don't pay the luxury tax when they should. I look at the luxury tax and kind of view it, while I want them to pay it, there's no reason to pay it if you don't need to, in my opinion. I mean that, and that's not to save Gail Benson money. It's her money, not mine. I don't really care. She should spend it, I think. But I also get that if you're only going to do this once or twice or not very often, you've got to pick and choose the year that you want to pay the luxury tax for. And you've got to find the right roster for that. Last year, they were in the luxury tax, had to trade away Kira Lewis Jr. and dump a second-round pick in that deal to get it done. They didn't need to pay the luxury tax for Kira Lewis Jr., who wasn't in the rotation, wasn't playing minutes. Pay the luxury tax on a meaningful player. To me, Matt Ryan is not a meaningful enough player to make that distinction. If you could upgrade your center spot in a Brandon Ingram deal, and that meant that you need to bring more money back in that trade and pay the luxury tax, yeah, you better do it. And if you don't do that deal because you're worried about the luxury tax, I'm going to rip the team. Matt Ryan doesn't really fall into that same boat here. So having that flexibility for a potential Brandon Ingram trade later down the line, I do think would have been a good thing. Also, having an open roster spot, should you want to trade for someone, we'll look at this in tomorrow's show, Walker Kessler, because there's new reports about his availability out there. You could do that and just absorb him into a traded player exception. You just need the roster spot. So you don't necessarily have to give up a player, but you could just bring him in. But if you now have to waive somebody else, and maybe that's what they'll end up doing. If you trade for Walker Kessler, do you need Jeremiah Robinson Earl? I'm not necessarily certain that you do. So there's options for that sort of thing too. But this limits that a little bit. And I think by re-signing him to this new contract, whatever it might be, whether it's partially guaranteed, maybe he's just on a two-way and his salary won't count against the books either. Those are also options as well. It's a creative method of keeping him around for now, without having to pay him as much as you were doing before is likely what it's going to be. So overall, it seems a little weird to waive him, then re-sign him. But once you start to get in the salary cap machinations of it, it does seem to make a lot of sense. But I don't think he was going to have a big role this year. And if they were willing to waive him in the first place and not pay him, and I still think they're willing to waive him again, what does that mean for guys like Jordan Hawkins and Javonte Green? And I want to look at those two players in particular coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is my go-to ticketing app. And now Game Time is a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. When you go to a lot of ticketing apps, they show you the whole arena, what's a good deal, what isn't. Game Time Picks is going to filter out things that are just priced wrong, so you don't even need to deal seeing them or anything like that, and it's going to make finding the tickets to live events you want easier and get you in on the action. And Game Time is my go-to ticketing app for a variety of reasons. I love that you can see the view from your seats before you buy so that you know exactly what you're going to get when you arrive to your event. And they don't have it just for, NBA games. There's concerts, theater, anything live, they have it over there. Now that we know the Pelicans schedule, you can start buying your tickets to Pelicans games on Game Time right now. Go start making your future plans because you're not going to find a better ticketing offer out there. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And for your second listen today, the Locked On NBA podcast. There's no offseason in the NBA, and Locked On NBA provides daily basketball analysis from national and local experts in 30 minutes or less. No one keeps you as informed and entertained as Locked On NBA, available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And don't forget, become an everydayer of Locked On Pelicans. That means you listen Monday through Friday. We'll be at Media Day. We'll be interviewing people, bringing you all the insight you want. We're going to gear up and get back to 5 days a week before you know it. So subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. So we talked about Matt Ryan and the salary cap kind of implications, right? They basically right now by doing this saved, against the cap, $100,000 and then an additional $100,000 in luxury tax payments as of now if they just sign him to a veteran minimum deal. If there's just a partial guarantee and they waive him later, that's even more money that they've saved than they would have had they just kept him on the roster. So in some sense, there's going to be a different type of contract for him. But say they had just waived him and not brought him back, because I do think there's still potential that they're going to waive him in the future. There's some implications from that. And I think those implications fall on Jordan Hawkins and Javonte Green because, look, those are the two guys that were maybe going to be competing with Matt Ryan for minutes. And Matt Ryan played limited minutes for New Orleans last season. Played in a handful of games. There were some injuries in there too. And, started one and did fine. Shot the three, and that's all you were really needing him to do. But at times, no, he wasn't good last season for New Orleans. 28 games, averaging 14 minutes per with one start. 5.4 points per game, but he shot 45% from three, 3.3 attempts per game. Those aren't bad numbers for a very limited role, but could you give those minutes to Jordan Hawkins? Could you give those minutes now to Javonte Green? And I think that maybe fits what New Orleans needs. Matt Ryan was a one-dimensional player, right? It's as simple as that. Matt Ryan was a wing who didn't give you rebounding, didn't give you defense, and at times looked absolutely bad on defense out there. He's a limited player. There's a reason they signed him on a two-way and he doesn't have a solid spot in the NBA. So with that in mind, give his minutes elsewhere. And that's what it was likely going to be, that his minutes were going to go to Jordan Hawkins. His minutes were going to go to Javonte Green, who they've recently signed and who people seem to be really excited about. Green in limited minutes for the Chicago Bulls last year, did pretty well. We know that. So when you look at that and wonder if he can play a larger role, I think the answer could be yes. While his three-point shooting isn't as good as Matt Ryan, 37% on 3 attempts per game last year and 12.2 points in 26 minutes. We know about Jordan Hawkins and what he brought to the team last season as well. Give those minutes to those guys. But here's the bigger implication for those. Matt Ryan's a better shooter than, either of them in terms of percentage and just simply making his shots. He had a better three-point percentage than Hawkins, who was only at 36.6%. Not a bad number, but not a good number by any stretch. So you waived, in theory, the better shooter. What's it mean? It means you've got to play defense and be more than a one-dimensional player if you want to get minutes or have a role and a spot on this team. I don't want to say this is like a direct shot at Jordan Hawkins or anything like that, but certainly there is a subtle message, not necessarily being sent because it's probably there, but it's implied. You've got to do more than just be a shooter. That was kind of the thing about Jordan Hawkins coming into the league and what he was trying to kind of disprove last season. More than just a shooter. Be a defender, be a rebounder, be a facilitator, whatever it might be. You've got to do more than just shoot if you want to have a role on this team. And in Summer League, where Hawkins did not play particularly well, he tried to do that. It was running pick and rolls, trying to be more of a lead guard than an off-ball guard. I do think he has done a good job of rebounding for this team and playing, taller than he is. But you're going to need to play defense and do more than just one thing and do it consistently. So if they're willing to waive Matt Ryan, who is a good three-point shooter on a cheap contract, now they brought him back. So again, there's that side to it. Hawkins could get dropped from his role. That's what this is saying. This is saying, like, nobody is safe if you don't do what you need to do. If Matt Ryan had played outstanding defense last year, if he was a better rebounder than he showed, then he wouldn't have been waived. There's a fly in here, and it's super annoying if you're watching on YouTube. And he wouldn't have been waived and wouldn't be going through this. They would have been like, no, we value you. You're not our 15th man. You're going to have a solid spot, but we didn't think that going into the season. Hawkins, who was up and down in the rotation last year, could be in for a similar boat. Could be one of those situations where it's like, hey, man, you've got to do more. You'll start off in the rotation, but could you get dropped pretty quickly? And I wouldn't be shocked if that was the case. Javonte Green was brought in not because he's a good offensive threat or anything like that. He's brought in kind of as Najee Marshall's replacement, in my opinion, and to do all the dirty work and hustle. And we saw how many minutes Najee Marshall got last year. Knowing head coach Willie Green and how he likes to kind of run this rotation and what he looks for in players, Green fits that bill perfectly, right? And so by bringing him in, by waiving Matt Ryan, I think this puts Hawkins a little bit on the hot seat potentially of saying, hey, you better really show up this year and take a leap forward in other areas. Otherwise, your minutes are going to go to Javonte Green. And that's not a huge surprise, again, knowing head coach Willie Green. But on a team where we constantly say they need more shooting, and cheap shooting is useful, Matt Ryan wasn't going to get minutes probably over Javonte Green, given what they do on the defensive side of the ball when you compare those two. And I do think Green can probably push for Jordan Hawkins minutes, and Hawkins maybe will get at the start of the year. So there is potential there that could really kind of shake up the roster here with everything. So we'll see what ends up happening. Green, by the way, if you're an NBA person, people really seem to like him. And the big knock on him was his injuries over the year, and that's been kind of unable for him to really stake out a spot. But he's had some solid moments with the Chicago Bulls, and his time in the NBA. And if he's really a Willie Green kind of guy, which we're concerned about those kind of players a little bit, you also do need to develop young talent in Jordan Hawkins. But this puts a little bit more pressure on him. But I would not be shocked if Green gets significant minutes for this team as kind of the Najee Marshall replacement. We know Willie Green loves those kind of guys. If you're an everydayer, though, of Locked On Pelicans, we talked about this the other week with Willie Green, talking about how he needs to change, he needs to evolve. We want to see some coaching growth from him this year, too. So was this the right thing? Is it not? Only time is going to tell, and we'll probably get some answers early on in the season when it comes to the rotation and the roles that these players are going to have and who might get minutes and who might get dropped. But now, Matt Ryan back with the team a little bit. Someone who's not with the team is Josh Hart, former beloved player here in New Orleans. Not saying some great things after, but Dejounte Murray coming to the rescue a little bit, doing the right things. Let's talk about Murray as a leader a little bit. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we have something a little bit different for you now. Through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then, with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season and Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. And all you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. All you got to do is put a $5 bet down on whatever you'd like, whether it is the NFL in week one for college football season as well. That's all, all the sports are starting to come back here. But here's the thing. Maybe you're not an NFL guy. Maybe you're not a football person. You're an NBA person. The opening night lines are out for the NBA. Pelicans taking on the Chicago Bulls. They're minus 3.5-point favorites at home. You can get in on that line right now. Will it change later? Might not, might, but get in on the action right now. Trust the Pelicans, believe in what they're building if you want. So visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to download America's #1 sportsbook and the official sports betting partner of Locked On. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And for your second listen today, Locked On Saints, final preseason game. Who's QB2? We know Derek Carr's starting. Who's QB2? Ross Jackson's going to make sense of everything black and gold over at the Locked On Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So I've only caught snippets of what we're about to talk about. And it's more just this stuff tires me and I just don't want to hear it or see it anymore because it's kind of a tale as old as time. Josh Hart, beloved former New Orleans Pelicans player, right? Loved this guy. Kind of took a little bit of a shot. I'm going to defend him a little bit here. On a podcast, I saw the clip. I personally just don't care enough over this sort of thing because I just don't need to go infuriate myself with it to look it up and see what it was. But took a bit of a shot at New Orleans, the Pelicans, the city more than the team. And I mean the city more than the team for a reason because I'll explain. Saying that he's like, I don't know if anyone's going to be excited to be traded to New Orleans. And that's kind of surprising because when he was traded from the Lakers, he did all of the right things. All of the right things. Immediately was like, how do I get Pelicans gear in Los Angeles? I think where he was. How do I start repping the team that I'm going to be on right away? Remember, I think he immediately ordered Pelicans slides in the Mardi Gras colors. Immediately. And then he had pictures of him wearing them and everything. So this is someone who truly seemed excited to be traded to New Orleans and all that would entail. And then, years later going out and being like, yeah, no, wasn't excited. Now, I do think he fell in love with the city, enjoyed his time here. I've talked to him personally about that before, so I believe it. And here's what I think he maybe meant to say, but I don't really want to give him that much of a break because, I don't know, words matter and choose your words better. I think it's one of those things of maybe players aren't excited to be traded to New Orleans. It's not a free agent destination for a variety of reasons, and that's okay. But once they come here, people tend to really truly fall in love with the city and the franchise. So I think it's one of those things where you're right. Maybe you're not excited to be traded there in the beginning, but once you get here and kind of see how the team is run and how they operate, you are excited to be here and you embrace it. Josh Hart did that. It's a shame that now, not that he had a legacy here per se, but it's a little bit of a shame now, right? That this is going to be kind of the lasting impression. And he went from a beloved fan favorite who was kind of reluctantly traded away in the CJ McCollum deal to now being not public enemy #1, but yeah, you're dead to us, right? You didn't need to say that. It was an unnecessary thing to say. New Orleans doesn't need to be catching strays. And this happens all the time. But Dejounte Murray comes in to the rescue here and immediately saw that, quote tweeted it on Twitter and was like, I was excited to be here. I was excited to be traded here. He sees Zion Williamson and he spoke glowingly of Zion Williamson at his introductory press conference. Immediately after the trade was announced, he seemed to be tweeting and excited about it, kind of similar to Josh Hart did. And, knows Brandon Ingram is going to be playing potentially. More on that later in the week too with Brandon Ingram. He's doing all of the right things. It's nice to see him just stick up for a team that he hasn't played for yet. Right? Murray hasn't gotten, the whole fan experience playing in the Smoothie King Center, having that experience there and going through all of that. But he's already shown that he is a leader by defending not just the Pelicans, but the city as well. And that's what you love to see from everyone on this team. That's how they should act, to be perfectly honest with y'all. So Murray doing that is great, but it just shows his leadership qualities. The Pelicans are in California. It was reported by Will Guillory that they were going to be organizing team activities for themselves. Murray was a big part of that. Murray, I think, since the trade, has only worn Pelicans gear every single day. You want to see that kind of buy-in. Now, look, there's the small asterisks of this that Murray's time in Atlanta seemed to have been just purely dysfunctional. Him and Trae Young didn't mesh, didn't click, didn't fit. And because of that, he probably wanted to go anywhere and probably would have been thrilled about being traded anywhere other than just staying in Atlanta. But look, I'm happy that he's here and repping the team in a positive way because that's what we want to see. Defend this place because we defend these athletes, right? You invest in them. You invest your time. You invest emotionally in them and this team as well. And you just want to be loved back. And that makes perfect sense. So for Josh Hart to go out and say those things, I do think there was probably more to the quote and everything, and he tried to kind of back it up and explain it, but at that point the damage kind of was already done, it felt like. But it was just disappointing to see that from someone who was so embraced by New Orleans overall. We loved that dude and all the dirty work that he did, that Najee Marshall role before it was Najee Marshall, all of that. Really loved that guy as a player and how he immediately embraced the city. But I do think that maybe while players aren't excited to be traded here, and fine, whatever, even though that's so annoying to hear over and over and over again, they do end up loving the city and embracing the city and enjoying playing for this franchise. Zion seems to have come around and really enjoys being here, right? Brandon Ingram wants to be here. CJ wanted to be here. Look at Larry Nance Jr., who was traded away, and how he embraced the city. Josh Hart did the similar thing. Chris Paul did the similar thing, even though he wanted to be gone at one point, right? A lot of people end up here and are like, oh, I dig this. So while we don't like the initial reaction of oh, I got to go there, the fact that they come around, I think, says a lot about the city, the fan base, just the people in general in New Orleans and the franchise too, and says it in a very positive light, a positive way. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you give Josh Hart a little bit of a pass, or is he dead to you? I get it. Let me know in the comments down below on YouTube. So that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. I appreciate y'all so much for listening. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at Nola Jake on Twitter, and I'll be back with y'all tomorrow. Where's the... Oh, there it is.